Hello, everybody. This is Christine Muscat, and I would first of all like to thank the Malta University Historical Society for this opportunity to share with you a webinar. Well, let me share my screen. The topic I have decided to share with you today is Festa. So Yep, here we go. The first slide that you're seeing on the screen basically is a lovely street in one of our towns and villages decorated for the village feast, which is a very important celebration for our communities, a celebration which unfortunately this year may be restricted. Well, I'm going to take you back in time to the 18th century. To be more specific, I'll be talking about a period of time ranging from 1767 to 1797, so more or less the final years of the Magdalene Nuns in Malta. And this is the plan. The plan is to talk about the Feast of St. Clare. I will then be analyzing the Magdalene Nuns, and we will then draw some conclusions about that. The whole idea is basically to try to extract some ideas of how cloistered nunnery would celebrate their titular saint. So, yes, indeed, festas have been around for a while, and during the Hospitaller period, just like today, there were big festivals, there were smaller festivals, and there were also festivals organized in small, I would say, convents and monasteries. So we're seeing here a picture of the interior of St. John's Cathedral. This is a painting done by Antoine Favre, and it's in St. Petersburg. And you can see that the church has a festive atmosphere in it. This is possibly because they were feasting St. John the Baptist, the patron saint of the Order of St. John. They also had the processions, very long processions. Obviously, the larger the parish, the bigger the procession. Here we're seeing one of Valletta's processions. And of course, there were also some street celebrations. So some ingredients of the festa, which are still around today, were certainly there during the Hospitaller period. Well, here is the facade of the Magdalene Church and the Magdalene Monastery. Today, what is left are the two extremes, the church on the right and these storerooms, which you can see on the church on the left and the storerooms on the right. Practically the part in the middle does not exist anymore. Well, something in brief about the Magdalene Nuns. Well, it was a group of cloistered nuns that were present in Valletta from the end of the 16th century to the end of the 18th century. The community was suppressed by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1798. Well, the Magdalene Nuns used to abide by the rule of St. Clare. So they were known as the Maddalene, and they were also known as the convertite or the repentite, and I will be explaining why. But this group of Magdalene nuns made vows and they made vows of chastity, obedience, poverty, and clausura. And they lived by the rule of St. Clare. And this is clearly specified in this document, in a book in the archives of the Archdiocese of Malta, where you have the Regola di Santa Clara and the subsequent pages are actually an explanation of the different regulations that these nuns live by. Well, I was saying that they were known as the Magdalene monasteries, which were very popular at the time, were very particular monasteries. They were monasteries that were there to meditate and to pray for Christians, protecting, defending the faith. However, they also had the responsibility and the obligation of hosting, accommodating women who may have been prostitutes or may have been on the road to prostitution. So women who were leading a life of prostitution and wanted to change their lives and dedicate their lives to prayer, had the option of joining a Magdalene monastery. And that is exactly what was happening with our Magdalene community on the islands from the 16th to the 18th century. Prayer was not the only activity that was happening in the monastery from the 16th to the 18th centuries. Of course, they were cooking. When I say cooking, they were not only cooking for the community, which numbered between, I would say, 40 and 70. That the number of nuns in the monastery varied. However, I would say on average, there were about 50 nuns living in the monastery at a given time. So they were cooking, yes, for the community of about 50 females, but they also prepared cakes and cassate that they used to send as gifts to various important personalities, for instance, the Inquisitor, and this was done quite regularly. Nuns were also sewing. They were mending vestments, sewing vestments, embroidering what is known as chasuble, these religious vestments. And practically they were doing this against remuneration. So they were being paid for their sewing services. Besides such work, which one can term as female work, they were also doing other activities, such as, for instance, painting. And here we actually have a painting. This is hanging in the monastery of St. Catherine in Valletta. And it's not a very good picture, I admit, but this is my picture. The picture is actually hanging in a very high position. And I didn't do a great job. I admit it's not a great job. But anyway, it's a painting of the beheading of St. John. And it is clearly signed here at the bottom by a certain Suor Florinda Smiralda Chantar. And practically Suor Florinda was a Magdalene nun. So we understand that there were some nuns who were also painting, trying their hand at art. So let's go straight into the topic. We're talking about Festa, and immediately I've produced here on this slide a comparison between what the nuns spent for the feast in 1776, when they spent 67 scudi, 11 tari, and 18 grani, and 1797, when they spent 36 scudi, 7 tari, and 5 grani on their feast. So immediately one understands that in 1776, the expenditure on Festa was much higher than it was in 1797, a year before the monastery was suppressed. So somehow the feast went on a decline, definitely went on a decline as years passed by. I also included a little sentence here to explain that in the monastery of St. Mary Magdalene, not all nuns were on the same level. There were different categories of nuns, and there were also females present in the monastery who were not nuns. So let's start with the first term, nuns. Well, even there we had the choir nuns, which were the elite nuns of the monastery, one can say, and they were the administrators of the monastery, the mother abbess, the vicaress, the treasurer, and so on and so forth. And there were the servant nuns. The servant nuns were on a lesser level. They were the ones who were doing the domestic work inside the monastery and also caring for the elderly nuns. So there was a division, right? There were the elite nuns and the subordinate nuns. Then you had the educande. The educande were girls, presumably girls, daughters of well-off families, who were, I would say, elite families, who sent their daughters to the monastery to get an education. Then you had le donate, the donates. Now, the donates were females who entered the monastery, lived monastic life. However, they never took vows. They did not make vows of chastity, obedience, poverty, and enclosure, as I said earlier. Then there were also servants and slaves. So there's quite a mixture of, the community was a mixed community. So the feast of St. Clare, which falls on the 12th of August, and here I have a picture of a relief in stone that is in the church. This can still be seen in the church, and it's on the right of the main titular painting. On the left-hand side, there is St. Francis. So St. Francis on the left, and on the right is St. Clare. However, definitely the most important feast was the feast of St. Clare. Now, nowadays we have this expression in Maltese saying festa ta ġewwa and festa ta barra. The festa ta ġewwa is the sacred part of the feast, with all the religious activities being organized normally by the clergy and confraternities, and obviously with the participation of some members of the community. And then you have the Festa ta Barra, which is the secular, where you have the band clubs being involved, etc., etc. So let's talk about the Feast of the Magdalene Nuns, which was likewise organized in two parts. You had the religious part of the feast, and you also had the secular part of the feast. Now, in the documents I consulted, it is clearly stated that the Magdalene Nuns organized the Feast of St. Clare through money collected through alms. So they collected alms, and with the money they collected, they organized the feast. In the 1770s, the tradition was for the Magdalene Nuns to give gifts to the Grand Viscount, the lawyer, and they also used to send a gift to the palace. Somehow, at a later stage in the 1780s, the later part of the 1780s and in the 1790s, this tradition was no longer being practiced. So the Grand Viscount got a bowl, the lawyer got a bowl, a similar bowl, and the gift they sent to the palace cost them 1 scudo, it cost them less than the bowl. Well, why would they give these gifts? Well, we do know, because on one particular document it is actually specified, that the Grand Viscount got a gift, a bowl, for his efforts, per le sue fatiche. So my understanding is that these gifts were given to particular personalities who collected alms or who contributed significant alms for the festa to happen. Some alms may have also been transferred to the monastery from the Grand Master's palace. The Grand Master may have sent money to the Magdalene Nuns so that they can feast, and they would send him a gift in recognition for the contribution, for the Grand Master's contribution. So here we have the ingredients, I would say, or shall we call them the main players of the Solemn Mass. Solemn Mass meaning it was a sung Mass. So in the 1770s, you had the bishop, you had also a preacher who would obviously be invited to deliver a special sermon. You had a cleric who would be assigned the responsibility to recite the panegyric, and other clerics. Now, again, this is a practice that the presence of the bishop is, shall I say, specific to the 1770s, but then in the later part of the 1780s, this practice again seems to have gone out of use. It stopped being done. So that is why I highlighted the word bishop in yellow highlighter, because the bishop used to preside over and possibly lead the whole solemn Mass for the Feast of St. Clare in the Magdalene Church in the 1770s, but this then did not continue in subsequent decades. So it was a practice that went out of use, went out of fashion. The most expensive cost of the Magdalene Nuns feast was the music. And we see that in 1770s, the knights spent 28 scudi on music. So music was an important element of the Magdalene Nuns festa. We noticed that in the 1780s, the expense for the music was significantly less, 19 scudi instead of the previous 28. And this remained a constant, going down to 16 scudi in the 1790s and then going up again slightly in 1797, where they spent 22 scudi. So what is this telling us? It is telling us that the actual investment in music in the Solemn Mass organized for the Feast of St. Clare slowly went on a slight decline. I would say a decline is very visible. Another thing which I noticed is that in the 1770s and in the 1780s, we actually get the name of the maestro. We had Fra Giuseppe San Martin, and then in the 1780s, the maestro was Andrea Mallia. But then in the 1790s, we know there was music. They just say they spent 16 scudi for the music, but we don't get the name of the maestro. So this to me kind of indicates a little bit of a giving it less importance, I would say. So it certainly indicates that less attention was being given to the way the accounts were being compiled. It is clearly also a fact that certain procurators of the monastery who compiled the accounts were more detailed than others. So in the 1770s and the 1780s, the procurator was detailed and wrote the name of the maestro and other very interesting, I would say, details. But then in the 1790s, the procurator was a very, I would say, cryptic person who just wrote the basics and the basic facts and was very, very dry, So that's a possibility as well. They also, in the 1770s, we get to know that they used to lease an organ, and they leased the organ from Gaetano Turillo, and he was also paid for the transportation of the organ, and they also paid for a man to blow the bellows. So to operate this organ, there was the musician, and there was the person who used to blow the bellows. So an organ was one of the instruments they used to provide the musical entertainment. There were other contributors to the feast, to the solemn mass. There was a man who mounted the decorations in the church. There was a man who carried the decorations. Of course, the sacristan had to work harder during the feast, and he was given some extra money for his efforts. And we have these three people who I find very interesting. There was a director for distribution during the first part of the evening, what is known as the first vespers. Then you had helpers, and you had a doorman. Now, this is, again, specific to the 1770s. So we understand the presence of these service providers leads us to understand that elite people were attending the solemn mass, and quite a number of people were attending the solemn mass, so much so that they needed a doorman, so somebody to greet the guests, and of course helpers who would possibly lead the guests to their seats. And there was a person a director who was overseeing the whole operation. So this leads us to understand that the solemn mass organized for the Feast of St. Clare in the 1770s was indeed a grand occasion. So grand that it was presided over by the bishop. And how do we know this? We know this because they transferred the bishop's canopy from the Church of Our Lady of Mount Carmel to the Magdalene Church, and this cost them 3 tari. Interestingly enough, they also transferred cupboards, small cupboards referred to as credenzine, from the Church of St. Paul. Now, this is obviously something quite curious. Why would they transfer small cupboards from the Church of St. Paul? My suggestion is that maybe they use these cupboards to display their artistic treasures, more or less like churches do nowadays. When the feast is being celebrated, the church displays its artistic treasures. And it could very well be that these credenzine were used to display the artistic treasures, maybe some silver that the monastery owned. We come now to the other miscellaneous expenses, and what shall I say, gives us a window onto what was happening inside the church during the feast mass, the solemn mass. The two expenditures that give us this information are these two. 8.5 liters of white wine, which to me sounded like quite a significant quantity of wine. But that clearly is indicating that the number of celebrants was quite large as well. It could very well be that they had many clerics participating in the solemn mass, and so obviously they needed a quantity of wine. And another very interesting fact that I would say was new to me was the fact that they purchased laurel leaves, bunches of laurel leaves. So maybe they did not have the bouquets of flowers that we have in our churches nowadays when we celebrate feast days, but they had laurel leaves. They decorated it with laurel leaves. And interestingly enough, this practice of using laurel to decorate a religious space is something which can be termed as an ancient pagan practice, because chastity was symbolized in paganism by the use of laurel. And we have the story that the laurel was consecrated to Vestal virgins who vowed perpetual chastity. So who knows, the presence of laurel may have something to do with the fact that these were cloistered nuns who vowed chastity, besides obviously obedience and poverty and closure, as we said earlier. Well, what about the Festa Barra, the secular part of their celebration? Well, my understanding is that this happened in the courtyard. You can see the courtyard indicated with a red circle. It was quite a large courtyard, as can be seen through this plan of the whole monastery and its church and stores, etc. It clearly had to be organized in an outdoor space. Why? Because they used fuochi, and they had handheld flares, and they also had some kind of small fireworks. And obviously, because they had these fuochi, they could not have done this indoors. And the only outdoor space I can see in the monastery is obviously the courtyard with the fountain in the middle. So it is likely that after the solemn mass, they would walk into this courtyard and have this little party. A party that included food. Food that was possibly partially prepared by the nuns in the monastery in their kitchen, but they did pay a baker for baking services. So some cakes or pies may have been sent to an outside bakery for baking. Well, we don't get to know exactly what they did with these ingredients, because the accounts do not specify this, but one can sort of understand the type of food that the nuns had on display in the courtyard to celebrate the feast of St. Clare. They had oil, chocolate, lemons, 3 baskets of lemons, which to me kind of indicates that this may have been used to prepare some kind of lemonade. It was summer, August, mid-August, so as a refreshment, a lemon drink would be quite pleasant. They actually purchased bergamot oranges, cloves, flour, and more: eggs, sugar, biscuits, bread, sweet sesame, and as I said, they also paid for the services of a baker. What about the fun part? Well, again, we see some variances. In the 1770s, they purchased 100 handheld flares, what we refer to as in Maltese as suffarelli, And in 1787, they had 200 handheld flares. So we see that up to 1787, there was this higher investment in handheld flares. They also paid a person who used to produce these handheld flares. But then, from 1787 onwards, we see that the accounts do not include handheld flares. So it's a practice which somehow seems to have stopped abruptly after reaching a peak in 1787. And this is not such a strange thing, as I will tell you in my concluding comments. However, besides the soffarelli, they also purchased wood, brushwood, and sulfur for some kind of fireworks, which they simply refer to as fuochi. And of course, they paid for the transportation of these items. So what happened in 1787? We have this document, again in the archives of the Archdiocese of Malta, which specifies that in 1787, the bishop's office sent an order to the Mother Abbess of the Magdalene Nuns, obliging her to put aside any surplus money remaining from the feast of St. Clare, give that money to the procurator, and the procurator was in duty bound to spend that money on the feast of St. Francis. So it could very well be that the bishop decided that instead of spending money on handheld flares, they should actually spend that money to feast, to prepare some kind of small festival for St. Francis. So this is a possibility. There may be other possibilities, but this is one of them. So a quick glance at the expenses from, shall I say, and the surplus money from 1787, when this order was issued, up to 1797. We noticed that they had 8, 9, in 1791 they had 10 scudi, and by 1797 they had 0. They had no money at all to organize any form of festivity for St. Francis. So I guess they spent everything on the feast of St. Clare. So Jeremy Bosovin, a leading anthropologist who studied festa in Malta, he suggested that the main ingredients of festa in Malta were the manifestation, the way how a community wants to manifest its religious devotion, especially towards their patron saint. Another important ingredient in festa is patronage. Those whose, shall I say, the benefactors who give money for the feast, the contributors, as well as those who shall I say, offer their favors to the community for, shall I say, for other benefits. Then you have the festa as being a moment when the values, ideas, and beliefs of people are enacted. People, you can see in the festa different ideas surfacing and cultural beliefs that are shared among the community. The festa is also an opportunity for the people belonging to a particular parish to rekindle kinship ties and relationships with neighbors, and it's an opportunity for the village to showcase its prestige. Obviously, this also sometimes includes a little bit of rivalry. Well, all these ingredients can be traced, I would say, in the feast of Saint Mary Magdalene, the feast that the Magdalene Nuns organized for Saint Clare. You have the patronage of these patrons were given gifts. You have the ideas and values and beliefs of the nuns being enacted, their devotion towards Saint Clare, and the exhibition of their prestigious objects on the cupboards to showcase their community's prestige. Well, on a concluding note, we have a feast of Saint Clare organized right up to this very day by the Clarissi, the cloistered nuns known as the Poor Clares. And yes, they organize more or less, they have no, these nuns have no link to the Magdalene Nuns at all, but one can see that this cloistered community organizes a festival for Saint Clare, which does have similarities with the Feast of the Magdalene Nuns. They definitely go through a period of preparation, and you have also the religious and the secular festivities for Saint Clare. So I end on that. I hope you enjoyed my little presentation, and I hope that you will all enjoy summer with restricted festa celebrations, but we will still try to get through this bad moment in the best way we possibly can. Goodbye, everybody, and thank you for listening.